The most feared man in Chicago sent his ex-wife a hand-delivered invitation to his Christmas gala, not as an olive branch, but as a blade wrapped in gold foil. She arrived looking like she had never shed a single tear over him, holding the hands of two 6-year-old boys who surveyed that ballroom with the kind of cold, steel-blue stillness that had no business living behind the eyes of children. Quiet, unhurried, and entirely unimpressed by the room full of powerful people staring back at them. The most powerful of whom was standing at the very top of that room. Their father. "You sent for me, Sebastian." Carrie's voice rang out across the hush that had swallowed the entire floor, smooth and unhurried, the way a woman speaks when she knows she is holding every card at the table. "I thought it was only right that I brought your legacy along for the occasion." Sebastian Rico's champagne glass did not fall, but his grip on it tightened until his knuckles went pale beneath his tattoos. His jaw locked. The easy, sovereign smirk that Chicago's most dangerous men had spent years learning to fear simply ceased to exist. Because standing 30 feet away from him were two small boys in perfectly fitted tuxedos, staring back at him with his own silence, his own posture, his own unnerving, unblinking gaze. The kind of eyes the Rico bloodline had passed down like a family heirloom through 4 generations of men who built empires on other people's fear. He had spent 7 years believing those eyes would never exist. Now here they were, staring straight at him. Have you ever watched someone's entire world come apart in a single breath? That precise moment when every ruthless choice they ever made, every person they discarded, every lie they chose to believe, all of it lines up in front of them like a firing squad. Because what happened next in that ballroom was not a scandal. It was not a scene. It was a reckoning 7 years in the making. And if you have ever been written off, cast aside, or told that your worth had an expiry date, stay right here, because Carrie's did not walk into that gala to be pitied or forgiven. She walked in to collect what was always hers. And before this night was over, the most powerful man in Chicago was going to find out exactly what it costs to throw away the wrong woman. The Rico Tower Christmas Gala was never just a party. It was an annual declaration of dominance, delivered to every powerful family in Illinois, and dressed up in crystal chandeliers and a floral budget that could comfortably fund a small school for a year. The 80th floor of Rico Tower, which the Chicago Tribune had once rather memorably described as a building designed by someone who genuinely believes the sky should pay rent, had been transformed into something that sat precisely on the line between breathtaking and unsettling. Enormous arched windows framed the full Chicago skyline on every side, and a Christmas tree anchored the center of the hall so tall it nearly grazed the ceiling, wrapped in white lights that bathed the whole room in a warm glow that almost made you forget the kind of business that paid for all of it. Sebastian Rico stood near the head of the hall the way a man stands when he has never once in his adult life been required to wait for anything. He was 38, broad across the shoulders, with ink tracing up his neck, and jaw in dark, deliberate patterns that the city's socialites had spent years pretending not to stare at. His tuxedo was custom, midnight black, cut to a fit that made his tailor genuinely emotional about his craft, and Sebastian wore it the way he wore everything, like the world had dressed itself for his personal approval. His dark hair was swept back cleanly, and his eyes, that particular shade of steel blue that had made courtrooms and boardrooms equally uncomfortable for over a decade, moved through the crowd with the measured patience of a man who was never actually at ease, only waiting for his next move. Tonight, he had a very specific move in mind. Across the room, his soon-to-be-announced fiancée stood beside her father, Senator Hale Drexler, laughing softly at something a guest had said. She was beautiful in the precise, calculated way Sebastian had selected her for the right family, the right name, the right political weight to make the Rico alliance look almost respectable from a distance. By every measure Sebastian used to evaluate such things, she was a sound investment. Clean, logical, uncomplicated. "You've outdone yourself this year," said Marco Vitri, appearing at Sebastian's shoulder with a glass of aged scotch and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had helped engineer the evening. "The senator looks pleased. His daughter looks pleased. Half the room looks like they're already rehearsing their congratulations. He let a small pause settle between them before adding, "All things considered, tonight belongs to you." Sebastian allowed himself a slow exhale that passed for contentment. "Tonight belongs to the family," he said, and the word family sat in his mouth the way it always did. Clinical, functional, like a line in a ledger rather than something warm that lived and breathed. He had long ago convinced himself he was at peace with that distinction. He was about to find out how wrong he was. The elevator at the far end of the hall slid open with a soft chime, and every conversation in that room died at once, as though someone had reached over and turned the volume of the entire world down to nothing. Welcome back to Tale by Jaylene. Please hit that like and subscribe button to support this channel and stay with me, because what Sebastian Ricco was about to face had nothing to do with rivals, territory, or power. It had everything to do with the one thing his empire was never built to survive: the truth. 7 years before that elevator opened, on a Tuesday night in November when Chicago was doing what Chicago does best, making everything feel colder than it actually is, Carrie's Ricco stood in the marble foyer of the very same tower and waited for her husband to look at her like she was still a person. He did not. The rain outside was the relentless, indifferent kind, the sort that does not dramatic ally pour, but simply persists, soaking through everything without apology. It matched the atmosphere inside that penthouse almost perfectly. Sebastian sat behind his desk in the study, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the way he always sat when he had already made a decision and was only performing the courtesy of delivering it in person. A thick envelope rested on the desk between them. He did not slide it across. He let it fall from his hand and land where it landed, the way a man discards something he has already stopped assigning value to. "Sebastian," Carries began. The doctors were very clear. His voice carried no heat, which was somehow worse than if it had. 3 separate physicians, 3 separate conclusions. I have spent 2 years waiting for a different answer, Carries, and I am finished waiting. He finally looked at her then, and what sat behind those steel blue eyes was not cruelty in the passionate sense. It was something far more damaging than cruelty. It was indifference dressed up in logic. The Ricco name requires continuity. That is not sentiment. That is obligation, and you cannot give me what this family requires. Carries looked at the envelope on the desk. She did not pick it up. "I am your wife," she said, quietly and evenly, because she had promised herself on the elevator ride up that she would not let him see her break. "You were an excellent partner," Sebastian replied, and the past tense landed in the room like something physical. "Intelligent, composed, everything I needed in this position. But a queen who cannot produce an heir is not a queen, Carries. She is simply a woman in an expensive house." He stood, straightening his cufflinks with the same calm focus he brought to every transaction. "The terms are generous. The property in Boston, the full financial settlement, the apartment on Beacon Hill. You will not want for anything material." What she wanted was not material, and they both knew that. "You are making a mistake," she said, and her voice did not waver once, which took more strength than anything she had ever done in her life. "Whatever those doctors told you, you are making a mistake." Sebastian picked up his phone, signaling without a word that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion in his mind. "My lawyers will be in touch by morning. I would ask that you be moved out before the weekend. I have meetings." Carries picked up the envelope. She did not open it, did not tear it, did not give him the satisfaction of watching her react to its contents on his timeline. She simply held it at her side, looked at her husband one final time with an expression that carried something between grief and a warning. She was not yet ready to explain, and she walked out of that study, down the marble corridor, and into the elevator. The doors closed. The rain kept falling. And somewhere in a city that had no idea what was quietly growing in the silence Sebastian Ricco had just created, the truth was already alive, patient, unhurried, and entirely willing to wait 7 years for the right room to walk into. He called her hollow. He had absolutely no idea what she was carrying. "Boston does not care who you used to be." That was the first thing Carries appreciated about it. The way the city simply got on with itself. indifferent to the lives being quietly rebuilt within its neighborhoods, unbothered by the women who arrived with fake names, real pain, and absolutely no intention of being found. She had chosen a suburb called Marlowe's, crossing the same way she made every decision in those early months, carefully, practically, and with the kind of cold focus that only comes from understanding that sentiment is a luxury she could not currently afford. She was not Carrie's Rico here. Here, she was Claire Voss, a name she had borrowed from her maternal grandmother and worn like a second skin until it stopped feeling borrowed. She worked as a financial consultant for a mid-sized firm in downtown Boston that paid well enough and asked few enough questions to make the arrangement comfortable for both parties. Her colleagues knew her as composed, precise, and quietly formidable in a meeting room. None of them knew that she came home every evening to two boys who had inherited their father's eyes and their mother's survival instincts in equal, exhausting measure. Silas arrived 4 minutes before Soren, and from the very first week he had operated as though those 4 minutes granted him a seniority that his brother was under no obligation to respect. Soren, for his part, had responded to this arrangement by simply developing a calm, immovable stubbornness that could outlast almost anything, including his brother's considerable patience. Raising them alone was one of the most disorienting, humbling, terrifying, and unexpectedly funny experiences of Carrie's life. And she had been married to a crime lord, so her baseline for extraordinary circumstances was already fairly high. But the laughter lived alongside something much heavier. Every school registration form was a calculated exercise. Every parent-teacher evening required a version of herself that revealed just enough to seem normal and nothing more. She paid for everything in ways that could not be easily traced, maintained no social media presence under either name, and chose her friends, the very few she allowed close, with the same quiet scrutiny she had once applied to reading a room full of dangerous men, because the danger had not gone away simply because she had. The Rico reach was long, and she understood better than anyone that Sebastian's world did not lose things gracefully. What she had not fully anticipated was the moment Silas, at 4 years old, looked up at her from a drawing he had been working on with great seriousness for 20 minutes and asked why their papa did not live with them. She had rehearsed an answer to that question in her head approximately 40 times. Every single version of it dissolved the moment she looked into those steel blue eyes, his father's eyes, patient and direct and waiting, and she sat on the floor beside him, took a steady breath, and told him the most honest version of the truth that a 4-year-old could carry without it becoming a weight. She told him that some families were built differently, that different did not mean broken, and that he and Soren were the most wanted, most deliberate, most fiercely loved thing she had ever done in her life. Silas considered this for a long moment. Then he went back to his drawing. Soren, who had been listening from behind the couch the entire time, because Soren always listened from somewhere nearby, climbed out and sat on her other side without saying a word. She put an arm around each of them and stared at the ceiling of their small Boston living room, in a house that was nothing like the tower she had come from. It was the first place she had ever felt completely safe. And she was going to protect it with everything she had. What she did not know was that 7 years of silence had not buried the past. It had only given it time to grow into something neither of them was prepared for. 7 years is a long time to miss someone you have convinced yourself you do not miss. Sebastian had gotten remarkably good at it. He had built the skill the same way he built everything else, through repetition, discipline, and a complete refusal to examine anything that threatened the structural integrity of his reasoning. Carrie's Rico, as far as his daily operations were concerned, was a closed file, a chapter that had reached its logical conclusion. A decision that the circumstances had made necessary, and that he had executed without sentiment, which was precisely how sound decisions were supposed to be executed. He had told himself this so many times that he had almost started believing it. Almost. The problem was that the mind is not a filing cabinet. It does not neatly archive people simply because you have decided they belong in storage. And in the quietest hours of the morning, when Chicago sat dark and still outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, and the demands of the empire fell temporarily silent, Sebastian occasionally found himself in the uncomfortable position of remembering things he had no productive use for. The particular way Carrie's held a room without trying. The steadiness in her voice when everything around her was falling apart. The look she gave him that last night in the study, not broken, not begging, just certain in a way that had bothered him far longer than he had ever admitted to anyone, including himself. He buried those thoughts the only way he knew how. With work. The pressure to formalize his arrangement with Senator Drexler's daughter had been building for the better part of a year. Ilara Drexler was politically useful, socially impeccable, and came attached to a family alliance that would extend the Rico reach into territories that money alone could not purchase. His underboss, a calculating man named Dorian Vance, who had served the Rico syndicate for 15 years and worn his loyalty like a well-pressed suit, had been advocating for the match with growing urgency. "The announcement needs to happen before the new year," Dorian had said during their last council meeting. "The Drexler family is not known for their patience, and our rivals are watching for any sign of instability at the top." Sebastian had agreed, logically, cleanly, and without hesitation. But something in him had stalled. He spent 3 days trying to identify what it was before the answer arrived in the most inconvenient form possible: a memory. Carrie's standing in his foyer, envelope at her side, telling him he was making a mistake with a certainty that had never fully left the back of his mind. He had dismissed it then as the desperate protest of a woman unwilling to accept reality. But it sat differently now, 7 years later, in the silence of a tower she no longer occupied. He needed to be done with it. The invitation was his solution, or what he told himself was a solution, which is a different thing entirely. He would invite her to the gala, let her watch him announce his engagement to a room full of Chicago's most powerful people, and whatever stubborn, unresolved residue she still occupied in his mind would finally have somewhere to go. He would see her, she would see him, and the story would end in a room full of witnesses with no ambiguity remaining on either side. It was clean, it was final, it was exactly the kind of decisive action Sebastian Rico was known for. Marco had looked at the signed invitation with an expression Sebastian chose not to read too carefully. "Are you certain this is wise?" he asked. "It is necessary," Sebastian replied, which was not quite the same as answering the question. The invitation went out the following morning, hand-delivered to a Boston address that his people had located without difficulty. He had no idea she had been right there the entire time. He thought he was closing a door. He had absolutely no idea he was about to walk through one. The thing about a room full of powerful people is that they are very good at pretending they are not watching something fall apart. They kept their champagne glasses raised. They kept their conversations technically in motion. They kept their eyes moving in that practiced, peripheral way that Chicago's elite had perfected over generations of witnessing things at parties that were never supposed to be witnessed. But every single person on that 80th floor was watching Sebastian Rico stand completely still in the center of his own gala, staring at 2 6-year-old boys who were staring back at him with his own eyes, and understanding with the particular clarity that only comes from genuine shock that something historic was happening in this room tonight. Senator Drexler cleared his throat. Nobody moved. Sebastian's champagne glass came down slowly, finding the nearest surface without him looking for it, the way a man moves when his body is operating on instinct, because his mind has temporarily stopped accepting instructions. His eyes did not leave the boys. Sela's stood on Carrie's left, chin slightly raised, measuring the room with an expression that was so unsettlingly familiar it felt like looking at an old photograph. Soren stood on her right, quieter, watchful, taking in Sebastian, specifically with the kind of focused, unhurried attention that suggested he had thought about this moment before, and had arrived with his own set of conclusions already forming. "Sebastian," Marco's voice came from somewhere to his left, low and careful, carrying the specific tone of a man attempting to offer an anchor to someone he can see drifting. "Perhaps somewhere private." "Lock the building." Sebastian's voice came out completely level, which somehow made it more alarming than if it had broken. He did not raise it. He did not need to. The two words carried across the immediate vicinity with the quiet, non-negotiable weight of a man who had never once issued an instruction he did not intend to have followed. Nothing moves in or out of this tower until I say otherwise. Marco did not argue. He stepped away with his phone already in his hand. It was Alara Drexler who finally broke the brittle surface of the moment, appearing at Sebastian's side with the composed, slightly rigid expression of a woman who had been raised to handle social catastrophe without visibly perspiring. "Sebastian," she said quietly, "whatever this is, we should address it after the announcement. The room is." "There will not be an announcement tonight." He said it without turning to look at her, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had communicated to her in the entire 12 months of their arrangement. It was not unkind in its delivery. It was simply final, in the specific way that Sebastian Rico's decisions tended to be final, arrived at quickly, stated once, and not revisited. Alara's composure held for exactly 3 seconds before she excused herself in the direction of her father. Sebastian did not watch her go. He was already moving across the ballroom floor toward Carrie's, the crowd parting ahead of him with the involuntary, instinctive deference of people who understood on a cellular level that this was not the moment to be standing in this particular man's path. Carrie's did not step back. She had not come this far, held herself together through this many years of careful, deliberate silence to step back from him now. She stood exactly where she was and let him come to her, which told him more about who she had become in 7 years than anything she could have said. He stopped 3 feet away. The boys looked up at him. He looked down at them. And for the first time in longer than he could honestly account for, Sebastian Rico had absolutely nothing to say. He had spent 7 years building a world that answered to him. In the space of 4 minutes, 2 6-year-olds had quietly taken it apart. Sebastian Rico had built his reputation on the ability to remain composed in situations that reduced other men to rubble. It was, by most accounts, his most dangerous quality. Not the resources, not the reach, not the network of loyalties that stretched across Chicago like a second infrastructure running quietly beneath the city's legitimate one. What made Sebastian truly formidable was the cold, unhurried patience he brought to every confrontation, the absolute refusal to act from emotion when calculation was available. That reputation survived exactly 48 hours after the gala. It took his people less than 2 days to surface what 7 years of careful burial had concealed. The trail, once someone with the right motivation started pulling at it, unraveled with almost insulting ease. 3 physicians, all privately retained, all paid through a shell account that traced back, through 4 deliberately complicated layers, to a man who had sat at Sebastian's own council table for 15 years and worn the title of underboss like it was something he had earned honestly. Dorian Vance. Sebastian read the full report once, at his desk, in complete silence. Then he set it down, straightened the edges against the desk surface with 2 fingers, and sat quietly for a long moment in the way that people who knew him well had learned to recognize as the most alarming version of him. Not the version that raised his voice, but the version that went very, very still. The reasoning, when his investigators laid it out, was almost elegant in its ugliness. Dorian had identified Carrie's early in the marriage as a stabilizing influence, someone whose presence made Sebastian measurably less erratic, more considered, and fractionally more inclined toward restraint. For a man who had spent years carefully positioning himself as the indispensable voice in Sebastian's ear, a grounded and trusted wife was a structural threat. Remove Carrie's, sharpen the isolation, and the underboss becomes the closest thing to a compass the dawn has left. It was, by the cold arithmetic of syndicate politics, a sound strategy. It had also cost Sebastian his son's first 7 years of life. He called a council meeting for 9 o'clock that evening. Dorian arrived in his usual fashion, composed, well-dressed, carrying the easy confidence of a man who had attended hundreds of these meetings and navigated every one of them successfully. He took his seat at the long table, acknowledged the room with a measured nod, and looked toward Sebastian at the head of it with the practiced, neutral attentiveness he had spent 15 years perfecting. Sebastian placed the report on the table between them. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply watched the precise moment that Dorian's eyes reached the third page, and the careful architecture of 15 years of manufactured loyalty developed a crack so visible that the two men sitting closest to Dorian both shifted their chairs almost imperceptibly away from him. What followed was not theatrical. Sebastian did not make speeches. He did not deliver the kind of dramatic, unhurried monologue that lesser men used to perform their authority for an audience. He stated what he knew, identified what it had cost, and communicated the consequence in the fewest words the situation required. The other council members sat in a silence so complete that the distant sound of Chicago traffic 40 floors below was briefly audible. By midnight, the Rico Council had 3 fewer members than it had started the evening with, and Sebastian was standing at his window alone, looking out over the city he had spent his entire adult life commanding. He was thinking about a 4-year-old boy, asking his mother why his father did not live with them. He was thinking about the answer Carries had given patient, honest, protecting them from a truth they were too young to carry. He was thinking about how she had done that entirely alone. He had purged his council, but the man he was most furious with was the one looking back at him from the glass. Nobody had ever prepared Sebastian Rico for the specific humiliation of being ignored by a 6-year-old. He had negotiated with men who controlled ports, territories, and federal judges. He had sat across tables from people who wanted him dead, and conducted those meetings with the calm efficiency of someone reviewing a quarterly report. He had, on more than one occasion, walked into rooms where the entire atmosphere was arranged to make him feel small, and had walked out having reversed the dynamic so thoroughly that the other party spent the drive home wondering what had just happened to them. None of that had equipped him in any meaningful way for what he encountered on the second morning after the gala, when he knocked on the guest's suite door where Carries and the boys had been housed. A conversation he had not yet fully won the right to request, but which Carries had permitted with the measured, conditional generosity of a woman operating from a position of strength rather than obligation. Silas answered the door. He looked up at Sebastian with those familiar steel blue eyes, conducted a brief, thorough assessment of the man standing in the corridor, and then turned back into the room and said to his brother with complete composure, "It's the man from the party." Sebastian, who had been addressed by the Chicago press as the most feared private citizen in Illinois, stood in the doorway for a moment and absorbed that. He was the man from the party. The suite sitting room was a reasonably comfortable space by any measure, but Carries had managed, in the span of a single overnight stay, to make it feel like territory that belonged to her children rather than to the building. There were drawings spread across the coffee table. Soren was cross-legged on the carpet working on something with a seriousness that suggested architectural intentions, and Carries sat in the chair by the window with a coffee and the specific expression of a woman who was going to allow this to happen, but was not going to make it easy. Sebastian sat down across from the boys, with the careful, deliberate movement of a man approaching something he genuinely did not know how to handle. He tried with Silas first, because Silas had at least acknowledged his existence. He asked what the drawing was. Silas told him it was a map of Boston, specifically their street, because Soren kept arguing about which neighbor's house was closest to the corner, and Silas had decided the only resolution was empirical evidence. Sebastian nodded slowly, because the logic was genuinely sound, and also because he recognized, with an odd sensation somewhere in his chest, that this was exactly how he would have approached the same disagreement at 38. He tried with Soren next. He asked if he liked Chicago. Soren looked up from the carpet, considered the question with unhurried seriousness, and said, "Mum says the winters are aggressive." "She's not wrong," Sebastian said. "She's usually not," Soren replied, and went back to his drawing. The conversation that followed was not cold. The boys were not hostile, were not dramatic, were not performing any particular emotion for his benefit. They were simply children who had been raised by a woman who had given them a complete and stable world, and they moved through that world with a comfort and self-possession that required absolutely nothing from Sebastian Rico, and had not spent a single moment of their 6 years waiting for him to provide it. That was what settled into him, slowly and with considerable weight, over the course of that 40-minute morning. They did not need his empire, his name, or his authority. When Silas scraped his knee against the coffee table, and Soren looked immediately to his mother, and when Carries set down her coffee and crossed the room without being asked, the room reorganized itself around her without a second thought. She was their world. He was a visitor in it. He had arrived that morning intending to introduce himself as their father. He left understanding that the more important question was whether he would ever deserve the title. The first sign that something was wrong came at 11 minutes past midnight, when every security feed on the 80th floor went dark at the same time. Not one by one, the way feeds fail when equipment malfunctions. All of them simultaneously, with the clean coordination of people who knew exactly where the systems lived and had spent considerable time studying them. Sebastian was still awake. He had not been sleeping with any reliability since the gala, and he was at his desk when Marco appeared in the doorway with the particular expression that Marco reserved exclusively for situations where the available options had already been reduced to the least bad ones. "It's Callahan's people," Marco said, "and the Vega crew together." Sebastian looked up from his desk. "Together?" Marco nodded, and the significance of that single word hung between them like smoke. The Callahan Syndicate and the Vega crew had not agreed on anything in 11 years. The fact that they had found common cause tonight meant that Sebastian's decision to choose his sons over the business had communicated something to Chicago's underworld that he had not yet fully reckoned with, that the most feared man in the city had developed a vulnerability. And in the world Sebastian had spent his life building, vulnerability was not a private matter. It was an invitation. He was on his feet before Marco finished the sentence. Carries was already awake when he reached the guest suite, because Carries had spent 7 years sleeping like a woman who understood that safety was a condition to be maintained rather than assumed, and something in the building's atmosphere had shifted in a way her instincts registered before her conscious mind caught up. She was standing in the center of the room in the dark, one hand on each boy's shoulder, both boys beside her in the practiced, unhurried quiet of children who had been taught without drama that when their mother stood like that, you stood with her, and you did not ask questions yet. Sebastian took one look at the three of them and felt something rearrange itself permanently in his chest. "We need to move," he said, "right now." The tunnels beneath Rico Tower were not a secret he had ever intended to share with anyone outside his innermost circle, which by this point had been reduced considerably. They ran beneath the building's foundation and connected through a series of passages that dated back to Prohibition-era Chicago, when the city had developed an extensive secondary infrastructure for the movement of things the surface level was not supposed to know about. Sebastian had modernized them quietly over the years, for precisely the kind of contingency that was currently unfolding 40 floors above their heads. He led them down through the service levels, Marco behind them watching the rear, the sound of the boys' footsteps steady and quick against the concrete floor. Silas moved without complaint, navigating the narrow passage with his chin up and his eyes adjusting to the low light with an adaptability that would have impressed Sebastian under any other circumstances. Soren stayed close to Carries' side, one hand in hers, the other trailing the wall, not from fear, but from the same methodical, information-gathering instinct that had served him well on the carpet with his maps. At one point, the passage narrowed, and Sebastian reached back instinctively to guide Carries through the tighter section, and she took his hand without comment, which was not forgiveness, and both of them understood that clearly. It was simply two people who had once known each other completely, moving through the dark together because the situation required it. They emerged 40 minutes later into the cold Chicago night through a door that opened into the loading bay of an unremarkable building 12 blocks north, where 2 vehicles were already waiting. Sebastian got them in, shut the door, and stood for a moment in the freezing air, listening to the distant sound of the city, his city, the one he had commanded for 15 years, going about the business of dismantling everything he had built. He had never felt more certain of anything in his life. He had spent 15 years making Chicago afraid of his name. Tonight, he had used everything that name carried to get two small boys safely through the dark. It was, without question, the best thing he had ever done with it. There is a particular kind of courage that never makes it into stories about powerful men. Not the courage of confrontation, the kind that arrives with adrenaline and a clear target and the clean, forward momentum of a man who knows exactly what he is fighting. That variety Sebastian had always possessed in considerable supply. What he was doing now required something quieter and considerably more costly. The courage to look at everything you built, everything you sacrificed other people to construct, everything that had defined the architecture of your identity for 15 years, and set fire to all of it with a steady hand. He started with the ledgers. There were 14 of them, physical books maintained in a rotating series of off-site locations across Chicago, each one documenting transactions, arrangements, and agreements that had never been intended to see the inside of a courtroom. Sebastian had kept them partly out of habit and partly out of the specific paranoia of a man who trusted no one enough to let critical information exist exclusively in someone else's memory. They had always been leverage. They had always been insurance. Now, sitting in a safe house outside the city with Marco across the table, and a lawyer whose discretion had been retained at considerable expense, Sebastian opened the first one and began the process of turning 15 years of carefully constructed power into the most comprehensive piece of states, evidence the Illinois Attorney General's office had received in a generation. His lawyer had not quite managed to conceal his expression when Sebastian first called him. "You understand what you are proposing," the man had said carefully, in the tone of someone who needed the words to be spoken plainly before he could allow himself to process them. "I understand exactly what I am proposing," Sebastian replied. "Clear enough terms for the boys and their mother, full relocation assistance, my cooperation on every active investigation touching Callahan, Vega, and the remaining council members. In exchange, I walk away clean enough to attend a school play without looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life." The lawyer had written that last part down verbatim, which suggested it had struck him as either the most unusual demand he had ever recorded or the most human one. Possibly both. The process took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of controlled, systematic dismantling, accounts frozen, assets liquidated, shell companies collapsed inward like buildings being professionally demolished, each one brought down in the right sequence to avoid taking anything unintended with it. Sebastian approached it with the same cold, architectural precision he had brought to building the empire in the first place, which was perhaps the most honest thing he could say about himself, that he was, at his core, a man who did thorough work regardless of the direction. There were names in those ledgers he had protected for years, men who had sat at tables with him, eaten at his expense, operated under the safety of his reach. He turned every one of them over without ceremony, because the calculation was simple and he had always been good at calculations. Their exposure was the price of his son's freedom, and it was a price he paid without hesitation and without the comfort of pretending it cost him nothing. Marco resigned quietly in the 7th week. Not in anger, there was no confrontation, no dramatic severance. He simply appeared one morning, set his keys on the table, and told Sebastian that he had served the Rico syndicate faithfully for 12 years and that he intended to take his family to Portugal before anyone got around to asking him questions he would rather not answer in a formal setting. Sebastian shook his hand and let him go. By the 11th week, the Rico syndicate, the organization his grandfather had founded, that his father had expanded, that he had driven to the height of its power, existed in the past tense. He sat alone in the empty safe house on the final evening and felt something he had not expected. Not grief, not regret, something that sat much closer to relief than he had any right to feel, quiet, unfamiliar, and entirely real. He had burned the empire his family spent 3 generations building. For the first time in his life, the smoke did not smell like destruction. It smelled like the beginning of something he had not yet earned, but was finally willing to work for. The house in the Berkshires did not look like anything Sebastian Ricco would have chosen for himself a year ago. It was modest in the way that genuinely comfortable things tend to be, not modest as a performance of humility, but modest in the honest sense that the people living in it had decided that a fireplace, enough rooms, and a yard with sufficient space for 2 6-year-olds to conduct whatever territorial negotiations they were currently involved in was, in actual fact, enough. There was no security detail visible from any window. There were no vehicles idling at the perimeter. The only thing standing between the front door and the outside world was a mat that said welcome in letters that Soren had repainted 3 weeks earlier because the original color, in his considered opinion, had lacked conviction. Sebastian had not argued with the assessment. It was Christmas morning, and the living room had been overtaken in the complete, cheerful way that only children can overtake a space. Wrapping paper distributed across every available surface, with an enthusiasm that suggested the unwrapping, had been prioritized heavily over any concern for the floor. Silas was cross-legged by the tree, methodically working through a construction set with the focused, sequential determination of a child who had inherited an unfortunate amount of his father's need to understand exactly how things were assembled. Soren had abandoned his gifts temporarily to investigate whether the dog, a large, unhelpful animal named Gerald who had arrived in their lives 3 months ago with no discernible skills beyond companionship, could be persuaded to wear a bow, a project that Gerald was tolerating with the resigned dignity of someone who had accepted his circumstances. Sebastian sat in the chair by the fireplace and watched all of this. He was wearing a gray sweater that Silas had selected for him from a shop in town during an errand 2 weeks earlier, pointing at it with the brief, authoritative certainty of a child who has decided and is not entertaining a discussion. It was not the kind of thing Sebastian would have chosen independently. He wore it without reservation. He was learning, with some effort and occasional coaching from Carrie's, that the point of certain moments was not to have preferences, but simply to be present for them. A concept that had taken 38 years and the complete incineration of a criminal empire to make available to him, which was perhaps a longer route than most people took to arrive at it, but there it was. Carrie's was in the kitchen, and he could hear the quiet sounds of the morning moving around her. The coffee, the radio playing something low and seasonal, the specific domestic piece of a woman who had built a life entirely on her own terms, and was allowing someone back into it on a provisional basis that she had every right to enforce, and that he respected without condition. She appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs, crossed the room, and handed him one without ceremony. She settled onto the arm of the adjacent chair, watching Soren negotiate with Gerald, and for a while neither of them said anything because the moment did not particularly require words. Sebastian looked at her. She did not look back immediately. She was watching the boys in the way she always watched them, with the full, unhurried attention of a woman who had spent 7 years being the only constant in their world, and had not yet entirely relinquished the vigilance that came with that. But after a moment she felt his gaze and turned, and she looked at him with an expression that was not quite warmth and was not quite distance, but lived honestly in the territory between them. The place where things were still being rebuilt, carefully, one morning at a time. He was on probation. He understood that fully and without grievance. He had earned nothing beyond this chair, this sweater, and the provisional grace of being allowed to sit in this room while his sons dismantled Christmas with complete abandon. It was the most he had ever had. He had once commanded the most feared organization in Chicago. He had traded it, deliberately and without regret, for a boy trying to dress a dog and another one building something on the living room floor. And sitting there in the Berkshire quiet, with the fire going and the coffee warm and Carrie's within arm's reach, Sebastian Ricco, for the first time in his life, felt like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. Sebastian Ricco walked into that Christmas gala as the most feared man in Chicago and walked out as something he had never been before. A father with something worth protecting that had nothing to do with power, territory, or legacy. Carrie's never asked to be rescued. She rescued herself, raised two extraordinary boys entirely on her own, and when the moment came, she did not return to beg or to break. She returned to deliver the kind of truth that changes a room permanently. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of quiet, unshakable strength that deserves to be remembered. If this story moved you, if you found yourself somewhere inside it, in Carrie's dignity, in Sebastian's long road back, or in those two boys who never once doubted their mother, then let us know in the comments below. Stories like this one only find the people who need them when the people who love them pass them forward. Like this video, share it with someone who understands what it means to be underestimated, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Every comment you leave tells us that these stories are worth telling, and we intend to keep telling them. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.